Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and Pew Research Center. This is the second webinar in a two-part series that we are doing together. Our first webinar in August focused on COVID-19 discrimination and hate. And our second webinar today is focused on our voting power, raising our voices through elections. During this webinar, we will discuss Pew Research Center's latest survey findings on the US electorate and naturalized citizens, including disaggregated data on the Asian American community. In addition, we will discuss efforts to protect voting rights for the growing Asian American electorate and the importance and benefits of naturalization for our communities. Thanks for joining us today. We are joined by three wonderful colleagues in research, voter protection, and naturalization today. Neil G. Ruiz is Associate Director of Global Migration and Demography at the Pew Research Center. He studies the international movement of people across borders, high-skilled immigration to the US and around the world, demographic analysis of Asian Americans, and comparative legal immigration systems. Prior to joining the center, Neil was the executive director of the Center for Law, Economics, and Finance at George Washington University, and he has also worked as a migration and economic development expert at the Brookings Institution, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. He is a political economist with a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a master's degree from Oxford University, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley. Neil regularly speaks about US immigration and international migration research with major print and broadcast media. We're also joined by two of my colleagues. Terry Outminis is the Senior Director of the Census and Voting Programs for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Terry is a widely respected authority on census and voting rights. She was one of the key leaders in the campaigns to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act in 2006, as well as to address the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder. Terry has published several articles, chapters in all 4 editions of the American Bar Association's Elections Handbook, and has been counsel on numerous amicus briefs filed before the Supreme Court on voting rights cases, including Shelby County v. Holder. Terry received her Juris Doctor, cum laude, from American University Washington College of Law and her bachelor's degree in economics at the University of Chicago. And we are also joined by Marita Ecubanez, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Prior to joining Advancing Justice, AAJC, Marita was the Director of Legal Services for the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center in Washington, D.C. Her 10 years of experience providing direct legal services to low-income communities includes advocating on behalf of migrant and seasonal farm workers with Texas Rural Legal Aid, as well as working with labor pool workers as part of the Homeless Persons Representation Project in Baltimore. Marita holds a law degree and bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan, and she is admitted to practice in the state of Maryland and the District of Columbia. We will have Q&A at the end of the webinar, and you can use the Q&A portal to ask your questions. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please also use the questions box to send us your questions. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our first speaker.
Thank you, Bessie, for having me. This has been great to have this two-part series. And I'm honored to kind of present some of the findings that we've had studies on Asian Americans in particular as the elections are coming up in just about over a month from now. So what I'll present today is about the electorate, but before we start about the electorate, I need to give you really a historical background of what's been changing. We just released a study about last week, at the end of last week, that's showing that in 10 states, there has been double-digit declines of non-Hispanic white voters between 2000 and 2018 for non-Hispanic white voters in 10 different states. So as part of that increase has a lot been with Hispanics and Asian Americans. So what I want to achieve here before to get to the electorate numbers to really talk about how did this happen. So first off, it's all about immigration. The story of a lot of Asian Americans have been a story of immigration. First off, you see here, real broad historically, in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, you had more of a Northern European wave, Southern Europe, Eastern wave, and then most recently we are in the modern wave of immigration since 1965, since the historic Immigration and Nationality Act of 65, where they allowed people from Latin America and Asia to immigrate into the US. So this is where we are now, and here's kind of like a broad sweep of what happened before this happened. In 1960, this is the top foreign-born immigrant group by state. You see it's really dominated by Europeans, except for Mexico along the border. But you see, at least in 1960, you did see Filipinos were big in Hawaii, but you see that it was majority, largely European as well as Mexican, and just in a few border states. But then by 2013, you saw a very different map. You see the top immigrant group per Philippines and Alaska, Hawaii. You see Indian Americans are the largest in New Jersey, Chinese in Massachusetts, as well as in New York, or in Pennsylvania. So you see a very different landscape and really dominated by Mexicans in the United States. You see this throughout the US states. So, but in terms of Asians arriving as immigrants into the US, you see that since 2009, there's been more Asians arriving as immigrants in the US than actually Hispanics. This is something that's leading to this fast growth of Asian Americans in the electorate itself. And here's kind of like a projection that we made in a world without 1965 immigration wave. You would have very different demographics. You would have, you can see here that here's the actual, on the left, the actual population from between 1965 and 2015, where you see a large, more non-Hispanic whites that have became kind of part of the American story. Whereas if you didn't have this wave of immigration, you would have had a very different demographics, which would be more continuing, less non-Hispanic white and more white. So let me go to Asian Americans. Again, this is a very diverse group. People are immigrating from very different places, and Asia as a continent is huge. If you ask people in Asia between Filipinos versus Indians versus Japanese, they're not the same identity when you go to the origin, but becoming part of the Asian American story is very different. People immigrate to the US and have some commonalities, but there are still some differences on their experience. So here, when we think of Asian Americans as a whole, 85% of the population in the US is dominated by 6 groups, or Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. So if you just straight up in terms of numbers, if you just focus on Asian Americans as a whole, you'll only be telling the story of the demographics of these 6 groups usually. And this is where it leads to a lot of people talking about kind of the, Asians are all highly educated, or leading to all doing really well, because they're really focusing just on the top 6 origin groups. But then you see there's a lot more, there's 19 plus different groups that are actually a lot smaller. And then when you do disaggregate the data, it tells a little different story. But here you could also see different immigration waves are within Asian Americans. So you see that Bhutanese, 92% of the population who are Bhutanese Americans are actually foreign born. They're still really recent immigrants. Whereas those who are Japanese Americans, only 27% were born outside of the country. So a very different experience in terms of being close to the immigration experience. And then income, this is very different. So again, going back to the immigration story, you see that many people, you see here, Indian Americans have a household income of $100,000 per year. This is the highest of any racial and ethnic group. But then you see Burmese, Nepalese, Hmong, much lower household incomes. And this has a lot to do with also how people are selected into the United States. Indian Americans usually are coming in as H-1B visa workers. Those are selected, they have to have a mandatory bachelor's degree or above, and many Indians actually have at least a graduate degree. Many in the US have a graduate degree. So this means the higher earnings. Whereas those who are Burmese, those who are Hmong, they came in as refugees. So very different circumstances of escaping their countries of origin. So that's why we see these differences of income. Then when it comes to education, same thing. You see that Indian Americans, very highly educated, 72% have a bachelor's degrees or above, whereas those who are Bhutanese, Laotian, Hmong, Cambodian, much lower educational attainment. So, and also in poverty, in terms of poverty rates, you see high poverty rates among those, especially those who came in as refugees into the US, whereas those who are Indian, Filipinos, Japanese, you see much lower poverty rates. So when it comes to income inequality, Asian Americans actually, compared to other racial groups, has the highest income inequality within the racial group. What does that mean? Those who are in the top 10 percentile of Asians in the United States earn 10.7 times more than those who are in the bottom 10% among Asians. This surpassed Black Americans in the US, which used to be for historically a long time. So you see here, 1970 to 2016, this big difference in terms of income inequality within the racial and ethnic group. And you could see here, between 1970 to 2016, in 1970, the top 90th percentile earners who are Asian in the US earned $68,000 in 1970, but in 2016, $133,000 per year. But in 1970, for the bottom 10 percentile, $11,000 per year. And in 2016, not much changed. So the bottom 10 percentile is still earning very low. They haven't really moved up and haven't been economically mobile. And when you look at Asians as a whole, well, you can see, or the top half of Asian Americans, you see that they're actually moving away, earning more than even whites in the United States in terms of, but then again, if you don't only look at the top half, you don't look at the different disparate story among various different origin groups. But then you see that the top half is moving even farther away from white Americans. So what does this mean for elections? So you can see that Asian Americans, here are the numbers. You see from 2000 to 2020, this upcoming election, you see that the Asian American eligible voters have reached new heights in 2020. You see that we grew from 4.6 million in 2000 to a projected number of 11.1 million Asian eligible voters in this upcoming election. This is an increase of almost about 5% of the US electorate are Asian Americans. But what's distinct is that Asian Americans are actually majority immigrant. They have the experience of being born abroad and coming into the US, naturalized as US citizens, and then voting. So, and you can see here, US born, those who are children of immigrants are a smaller proportion of the broader Asian American electorate. And then by origin, you see that the biggest populations, Chinese, Indian, Filipino, and Vietnamese and Korean, are the biggest part of those who have naturalized and also who are second generation voters in the US. So you can see this is kind of like by size. And then by state, which everyone knows that presidential elections matter by state because we have an electoral college. You see that the top 10 states and largest Asian American eligible voters are California, New York, Texas, New Jersey, and Hawaii. Whereas those as a percentage of the electorate, the state's electorate, you see Hawaii is the largest with 38% of the eligible voters there who are Asian Americans. California, 14% of the California's electorate is Asian American. Nevada, you have 8%, and you can see here, these are quite important and large percentages that could actually swing a vote of a state. And then to hone in, when you compare Asian Americans compared to other groups, you see that Asian Americans are really an immigration story. Again, naturalization is really part of the story that unites a large proportion of Asian American voters. 67% were born abroad. Whereas in Hispanics, you see that only 25% were actually foreign born. So, and 75% were born in the US and then became, rather than naturalized citizens, those are the voters. So when it comes to immigration, it's an issue or something that is part of the Asian American electorate experience. And then going back to what I talked about earlier in terms of looking at the income and the origins, how there's differences by origin group, you see that English proficiency also varies. So you see that Japanese Americans are 91% are speak English really well, but you see Burmese, Vietnamese, and other origin groups have lower English proficiency, as well as when it comes to education attainment. You see that some groups have a much lower, like Vietnamese and Cambodians versus those who are Indian and Chinese. And this has implications for how you do outreach during a campaign. If you offer just in English, will you be reaching out to the organizations that you want to, or do you need to offer it in multiple languages? That way people understand what you're talking about. So now, last slide, I just want to talk about voter turnout, because this is in everyone's minds right now. So the US born usually have a long history of having higher voter turnout rates rather than those who are foreign born. But when you break it down by racial and ethnic group, actually for Hispanics and Asian Americans, it's actually higher for foreign born to turn out in presidential elections than those who are the second generation. So the foreign born, again, the naturalized citizens have a higher motivation to vote, at least historically in the past presidential elections, than those who are second generation. So, and lastly, you're going to see polling numbers and coming in the beginning of November during election night, exit polls. I know it's frustrating where you're going to see racial breaks, and then you're going to miss Asian Americans there. And this is an issue that's been, even though there's been advances in polling, it's been an issue in terms of reporting out Asian American voters. As I showed earlier, it's challenging because there's such diversity, and you must offer in multiple languages if you want to make sure that, because there's a high foreign born population, you need to make sure that you have you offer different languages so that people can participate into your surveys or your exit polling. So that's an issue that's very important to understand. Otherwise, you're just capturing those who are English speaking, and also usually people say it's too expensive, they just don't do it, which is majority of the time, and they're also fast, so they don't do it. So, but then the issue is that there's also large origin groups, different origin groups with diversity, as I showed earlier, which is another challenge. You don't want to also think of Asian Americans as a monolithic group also as well. But I will end there, but looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Neil, thank you. I will pull up our PowerPoint and turn it over to our next speaker, who is Terry Almanis.
Thank you, Bessie, and thank you, Neil, for all that great information about the community. You can go to the next slide, Bessie. While it's great to see and hear about all the energizing information about the Asian American electorate and how we are expanding and growing, I think it's also important that we realize that our communities continue to experience depressed voter participation rate, or as I like to think about it, it's really that we're not maximizing our potential political power. So on this slide and the next slide, you will see that there continues to be a gap between voter registration and voter turnout rates of Asian American voters as compared to white voters, with I think we see about a 15 to 20% difference from election to election. In addition to the interesting point that Neil raised with respect to those who are naturalized citizens versus native-born citizens and how they participate, another interesting point to note is that once Asian Americans are registered, the turnout rate of those registered achieve at least parity, or in some cases maybe higher, for Asian American voters. You can go through the next slide, Bessie, and then this. Perfect. So, of course, the language barrier is one of the biggest major obstacles to optimizing voter participation in the Asian American community. 71% of Asian Americans speak a language other than English at home, a rate second only to Latinos, and roughly 1 in 2 Asian American adults are limited English proficient, that is, face some challenges communicating in English. Next slide, please. And as Neil noted, with the diversity of the community, Asian Americans speak dozens of languages and dialects. We also know that 21% of Asian American households are linguistically isolated, meaning that all household members 14 years and older speak English less than very well. And this comes into play in sort of barriers that we see that exist for language minority voters. These include the fact that voting materials are too complex, right? An analysis of voter materials from all 50 states revealed that they are consistently written at high school or college levels and use complex English, such as containing longer sentences and words, as well as complicated vocabulary and grammar. For naturalized voters, the level of English needed to become a citizen is generally at a lower level than that. Second, the voting process is complicated, especially for language minority voters that come from countries with either different or perhaps no democratic system who need to learn to navigate the daunting complex election process in America. We also know that language minority voters are often denied needed assistance at the polls, with poll workers often unaware of the rights the voters might have. And finally, language minorities may experience discrimination through hostile and unwelcoming environments, as well as the blatant denial of their right to vote. Next slide, please. And while the language barrier is among the biggest hurdles, additional challenges face Asian American voters. This includes the fact that tremendous growth in emerging communities also often means that there is a lack of infrastructure, a lack of existing government relationships, and a distrust of government. Again, I had mentioned a lack of knowledge about the voting process and all the steps that take place before voting. And again, voting discrimination and voter suppression aimed at Asian Americans impede our community's ability to vote. Sometimes that's tied in with being a language minority voter, and sometimes it's simply for the fact of being an Asian American. One such barrier is the persistent racist stereotype of Asian Americans being quote unquote perpetual foreigners. And this leads to instances where Asian American voters are challenged or accused of being ineligible to vote simply because of the color of their skin. And other times, sometimes because of the accent that they have. We've also seen instances of voter discrimination where Asian American voters with language barriers were segregated into separate lines from fluent English speakers, or where only Asian American voters were asked to provide voter ID, even where there were no laws existing that required a photo ID at the polls. Next slide. So an important provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that helps to address some of these barriers is Section 203, which was enacted in 1975 to remedy racial discrimination in the voting process that results in the disenfranchisement of language minorities from 4 language groups: Latinos, Asian Americans, American Indians, and Alaskan Natives. Next slide, please. Oh, hold on. Before we go. Which jurisdictions are covered are determined every 5 years. And the last determination was actually made in December of 2016. A new set of determinations are scheduled for December of 2021. And the director of the Census Bureau makes these determinations, which are final and not reviewable by any court. Next slide, please. So currently, the Section 203 coverage for Asian languages finds that Chinese has the most coverage with 18 political subdivisions covering 7 states. Next is Vietnamese with 9 political subdivisions in 4 states, Filipinos with 8 in 4, Korean with 4 in 3, Asian Indians with 3 in 3, and Cambodian with 2 in 2, and Bangladeshi with 1 covered political subdivision. Next slide, please. Once covered, Section 203 requires that the jurisdiction ensure that all the information provided in English is also provided in the covered language. And this includes registration or voting notices, forms, instructions, ballots, and really other, any material or information related to the electoral process. It also requires the provision of oral assistance or bilingual poll workers at polling sites and the publicity prior to Election Day that these language assistants are available at polling sites. Next slide, please. Another important provision of the Voting Rights Act that can help address the language barrier is Section 208. And this is a nationwide provision that was enacted in 1982. And Section 208 provides voters requiring assistance to vote by reason of blindness, disability, or the inability to read or write, the right to have someone assist them in the voting process, so long as that person helping them is not their employer or their union representative. Language minority voters with language barriers can utilize Section 208 to bring someone with them to the polls to assist them, such as a friend or a relative. And unlike Section 203, there are no limitations as to which language groups can take advantage of this or a specific geography in which this applies. This applies everywhere. Next slide, please. Also interesting to note, jurisdictions can actually decide to proactively and voluntarily provide language assistance to any language minority group. And I will note that certain jurisdictions and municipalities have also taken upon themselves to offer or expand the availability of language assistance to different groups. For example, in Chicago, in our affiliate, Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, has worked on and been able to secure some local language assistance that expands the coverage of language access to voters in other communities, in addition to additional Asian languages, also other communities such as the Russian community, Polish community, and so forth. Looking at the 2016 determination data set, we actually see that there's a good number of language groups that just miss coverage, and they are likely to be covered during the next determination. And I think interesting to note, just when we were going through the data points, we noticed that Asian languages coverage that were just missed would have covered 11 states, including 4 not currently covered, such as Maryland, Minnesota, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. So, as we all recognize, the 2020 election has certainly been thrown into chaos for many reasons, including the global pandemic. As we all work to address the public health and safety needs with respect to the 2020 election, I think there are specific ways to help ensure LEP voters can access the language assistance they need. First, we know that no excuse absentee voting and vote by mail has increased in the COVID-19 context as a critical way to allow for people to vote while maintaining safety. Voting by mail has been an important option for LEP voters, where they have the ability to vote from the comfort of their own home, taking all the time they need to vote comfortably and getting language assistance from their friends and relatives without having to coordinate schedules to go to the polls together. However, it's important to note that covered jurisdictions, that is jurisdictions that are covered under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, must still adhere and comply with Section 203 when implementing their vote by mail processes. Also, at the same time, it is critical to ensure that there are safe in-person options for a multitude of reasons. For limited English proficient voters, it allows them the opportunity to receive in-person language assistance in covered jurisdictions, that is Section 203 covered jurisdictions, at the polls where a trained bilingual poll worker can assist them. It's also important for LEP voters to be able to go in person, even if they don't reside in a Section 203 covered jurisdiction, because they can always take advantage of Section 208 and they can bring a friend, a relative, or colleague with them to help understand the voting process, the ballot, what they're voting for, and the like. And by being at the polling place with their Section 208 assister, they can ask questions of the trained and knowledgeable poll workers about the voting process, which they might not have access to if they were voting from home. So I think at the end of the day, it's important just to remember that LEP voters, as all voters, should have the options available to them, and they should be empowered with the decision to make the choice that's right for them with respect to whether they want to vote at home by mail, or if they want to vote in person in a safe, and public healthy, conscious, polling location. The last thing I will just note about voting in person is that we are mindful of the potential challenges during this particular election cycle due to the increased due to increased intimidation of Asian Americans that we believe could end up in seeing increased voter intimidation of Asian Americans, right? That is, seeing something, an extension of the COVID-19 related anti-Asian sentiments and violence that we have been seeing, unfortunately, this year, as well as potential increases in voter challenges against Asian Americans, again, based on the stereotype of Asian Americans being the quote unquote perpetual foreigner. Next slide. So what can you do to help? Of course, getting out the vote, right? First and foremost, everybody, we should vote that's eligible to vote. You should also help encourage friends and family to vote. You are a trusted messenger and can really help emphasize the importance of casting a ballot and making your voice heard. Help educate your friends and family about how to vote. What do they need to do? By when? Where do they need to go? Etc. And then, of course, volunteer with Get Out the Vote organizations to help them get out the word as well. Another way you can help out for the 2020 elections is becoming a poll worker. There's always a need for poll workers, as the pool of poll workers has generally been older. This is particularly critical in light of the current pandemic, as a significant portion of the existing pool of bilingual workers include those in high risk for COVID-19. We need people who are able to assist in this fashion to sign up to serve as poll workers. And of course, any language skill would be a plus. And again, as a trusted messenger, it would be wonderful if you can encourage others to become poll workers as well. Next slide. You can also become an election protection volunteer. You can help staff one of the election protection hotlines, including the one in several Asian languages that Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AHAC, runs along with API Vote. That is our API Vote line that provides assistance in Chinese, in both Cantonese and Mandarin, Korean, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, and English. You can also volunteer to become a poll monitor. But at the end of the day, there are also other opportunities to assist, and we just urge you to get involved. Next slide. And then finally, I just wanted to let folks know that there are resources available for all of the things that I've mentioned. And you can find this information, including translated materials, at www.advancingjustice-aajc.org/election2020. We have fact sheets about Section 203, 208, general election fact sheets. And you can find volunteer opportunities and the like. And we encourage you to reach out. And if you have any questions, certainly you can always reach out to me with those questions. And with that, I will stop and turn it back over for now and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. And everyone, as a reminder.
So I'm here today to talk to you about naturalization, which I think may seem a little bit disconnected for some of you from voting and elections, but obviously it is connected because one must be a US citizen in order to participate in elections here in the United States. And since, as Neil pointed out, our community is overwhelmingly immigrant, naturalization is a vital part of our civic engagement process. So I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about naturalization. So there are currently almost 9 million lawful permanent residents, also known as green card holders, who are eligible to become United States citizens. And yet fewer than 10% of these eligible LPRs naturalize each year. Just to put this in better context, here in the DC area, there are about 65,000 Asian American LPRs who are eligible to naturalize, but who have not yet done so. It's a lost opportunity to not have these dedicated and committed residents as full participants in the civic life of our country. Those who choose to live permanently in the United States don't need to be convinced of the enormous opportunities this country presents. And those opportunities are even greater for those who become US citizens. We know that the vast majority of green card holders, as high as 91%, want to become US citizens, but just don't know how. 61% of citizenship eligible LPRs have never received information, including from the US government. Some think it's just too difficult and that even if they get help, it would be too expensive. Neither of those is true. The process is much easier than many people think. And if one does need help, it is available, and in many cases, it's free. So next slide, please. So Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, is part of the New Americans Campaign, which is a national campaign with partners in cities and areas across the country that are working to provide free and low-cost assistance with the naturalization process. Next slide. So here's the list of our partners, just by way of example, here in the DC area. There are many groups that are committed to providing citizenship assistance. Next. So let's briefly touch on the top benefits of citizenship. And there are more than listed on this slide. So one of the primary benefits of citizenship is that one no longer risks deportation. With US citizenship, you need not worry about your immigration status anymore. 2, if you naturalize while your green card holder children who are in the United States are still minors, they automatically naturalize with you. 3, family reunification. In a lot of cases, it is faster for citizens to petition for their family members, and US citizens actually are eligible to bring over a larger category of relatives to immigrate to the United States. 4, eligibility for government jobs. Yes, many government jobs require US citizenship. 5, perhaps slightly less relevant right now, is freedom to travel. A lot of people covet that US passport and the ease of travel that it confers in non-pandemic times. And then 6, why we're all here now, one of the main benefits of citizenship is that it confers the right to vote. So next slide, please. So here are the basic eligibility requirements. One must be at least 18 years old to apply for naturalization. You have to have lived in the United States as a legal permanent resident for more than 5 years. And if you obtained your green card through marriage to a US citizen, then it's 3 years. To apply, you have to have been physically present in the United States for more than 2.5 of the last 5 years, or 1.5 years if you obtained your citizenship through marriage to a US citizen. One must demonstrate good moral character. This doesn't mean that you need to, be eligible for sainthood. Only that the application for naturalization there is an inquiry into one's criminal history. So that is important to keep in mind. And there are folks that can help you navigate that. One must be able to read, speak, and write basic English. So you don't have to be fully fluent in English, just have basic English skills. And there are actually exceptions to the English language requirement for long-time green card holders who are older. So I can provide more information about that later. And one has to be able to pass a 10-question test on US government and history. And in our citizenship workshops, we often hand out the flashcards for those, and I've seen many people diligently pouring through their flashcards. So these are all the basic requirements. Next slide, please. So the naturalization process, this is pretty straightforward. You complete and submit the naturalization application, the form N400. After a period of time, you'll be scheduled for an interview at your local USCIS office where an immigration officer will administer the civics test and test you on your English. And if all goes smoothly, then you are scheduled for an oath ceremony and you take the oath of allegiance to become a United States citizen. So it's all very straightforward. I know that the process can be intimidating for people who don't have a lot of information about what it entails. One key message that we want to convey is that the citizenship process is not like applying for your green card. This is much more straightforward. Whereas there can sometimes be a lot of hurdles to demonstrating eligibility and getting the green card, for citizenship, it's kind of the last stage in the process. And it is meant to be straightforward. And again, there are groups that are available to help. So don't let that stop you from moving forward with the process. Next slide, please. So one caution here, and if you've been following the news, you are aware that there has been a fair amount of turmoil at USCIS. So in recent years, USCIS has, for a number of reasons, really slowed down in their ability to process any number of immigration applications, including naturalization applications. The backlogs have grown over time. There are some periods of time in some jurisdictions where the backlogs are not as severe, but in other places they are quite lengthy. So, people who naturalized not that long ago are probably thinking that it costs a few $100s and maybe takes 6 months. It's now taking at least a year or more. And so the processing time for the DC USCIS office is 11 to 18 and a half months, and even longer in Baltimore, 12.5 to 27.5 months. So obviously at this point, it's too late to start the process if you hope to participate in this election cycle. But the main reason we're having this conversation now is, to urge people who are eligible LPRs not to get left behind for the next election cycle, right? If you're eligible for US citizenship, you should seriously consider starting now. And for people whose applications are already in the pipeline, we have a little bit of information here about voter registration deadlines here in the DC area. I realize this won't be applicable to everyone, but you can look up the voter registration deadlines in your area. So hopefully the people who are in the pipeline manage to get sworn in and become US citizens in time to meet the deadline so that they'll be able to vote in this election. So next slide, please. So this is just our encouragement slide. Becoming a US citizen is easy, opens the door for many opportunities, and we really do encourage people to consider starting the application process now. Next slide, please. And as I said, there are many, many groups across the country that are standing ready to provide assistance, including a number of Asian Americans serving community-based organizations. So these two flyers come from our partner here in the DC area, the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center, and they routinely provide assistance in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese, and can also find bilingual volunteers to provide assistance in other languages. So it's important to know that assistance is available. Next slide. This is also from the APLRC, but the main reason I included this slide is for the link at the top. If you go to our website, advancingjustice-aajc.org/become a citizen, you can access more information about citizenship, including a flyer that lists the contact information for all of our New Americans campaign partners here in the DC metro area. Next slide, please. And this one might be a little bit hard to read, I apologize, but we include the phone numbers here for the multilingual hotline that is operated by Advancing Justice Los Angeles. So if folks need language assistance in these languages, encourage you to call Advancing Justice LA, and they will try to connect you with an immigration service provider in your area. So that's part one of why this slide is here. The other piece is this community alert. So USCIS, unfortunately, will be increasing its fees across the board effective this Friday. So if you've already started the process and perhaps have been sitting on your application, get it out, have someone review it and try and get it in by this Friday so that you can lock in the current fee, which is actually $725, including the biometrics fee. Because as of this Friday, unless a judge intervenes via one of the lawsuits that's pending, the naturalization fee will go up to $1,170. And this change is compounded by the fact that USCIS fee changes also mean that they will be eliminating the reduced fee for citizenship and actually most fee waivers for naturalization applicants. So not only will the fee go up, but this rule change also means that most financial assistance that's available to low-income folks will be eliminated. So we have been working to sound the alarm about this coming change, and this is the final week to get applications in before the fees change. So that is another one of the main reasons why we included naturalization in today's presentation. So the last slide, again, here's our website where you can get more information on citizenship, my contact information if you have any questions. And again, we encourage people to begin the naturalization application process now so that you can avail yourself of all of the benefits of US citizenship, but also so that you'll be able to participate and vote in the next election cycle. Thank you.
Thanks, Marita. So it sounds like there are a lot of ways to take action, both in terms of election protection and also naturalization. Everyone, you will get a copy of this presentation after the webinar today. So you'll have all the great links and resources that Marita had shared from the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center, our organization, and New Americans Campaign. And so without further ado, we will open it up to questions. You can use the questions box to submit your questions and let us know if your question is for Neil, Terry, Marita, or all of our speakers. And so we'll pause for another minute while people submit their questions. So we had a question earlier from Timothy for you, Terry, if you could please clarify again what's covered under section 203. And I'm also going to hop over back to your slide. Like that.
Sure, and thank you, Marita, for putting in the link to our website where you can find more information around Section 203. Basically, what Section 203 requires of the covered jurisdiction is that the county, in most cases, must provide the information they provide to voters in English has to be provided in that covered language. And so that is everything from written materials, that can be sample ballots, voter registration forms, voter pamphlets, anything, again, that's provided in English is to be provided in language. It also requires the provision of language assistance at the polls, so that is in the form of bilingual poll workers, and also important that the jurisdiction is responsible for publicizing the availability of the language assistance to the impacted community, right? So you can imagine if you had all of this great language assistance available, but nobody realized that it existed, it really wouldn't achieve what it was trying to do. And really, I think sort of a gold standard to think about how Section 203 is implemented, it really is meant for the voters, the LEP voters in the covered language to be effectively informed and able to participate effectively in the elections.
Thank you, Terry.
I have a follow-up question. Terry, what recourse does one have if you live in a Section 203 covered jurisdiction, but when you go to the polls, they don't have any language assistance available?
So first, you should call our voter hotline at 888-API-VOTE. Thank you, Marita, for a great question. I would also note that please do contact us because we can work with you and work with local partners on the ground if need be to try to work with the election officials. Sometimes it could be that a jurisdiction is allowed to target where they put bilingual poll workers, right? So if your precinct or your polling site doesn't have a particularly high level of limited English proficient voters in that language, it may not be required to provide bilingual poll workers there. But we've also come across situations where they might actually have the translated materials, but it's hidden underneath the table, still in a shrink wrap and not put out and available for people. So I think the best course of action, definitely give us a call immediately, let us know what's going on, and we'll work with you and work with folks on the ground to try to get a resolution as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Terry, and great follow-up question, Marita. And here's the hotline again on the slide, 188-API-VOTE, and there's assistance available in English and also many Asian languages as well. And this question is from Shoshana. Do you know if Asian Americans have had a higher rejection rate of their mail-in ballots in previous elections?
So unfortunately, I don't think there's been a comprehensive study on the impact for Asian Americans across the board, but I do know that our sister affiliate in Los Angeles, Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles, did look at this issue and did see some abnormalities around the rejection rates of mail-in ballots for Asian Americans. And Betsy, we can also send that study around for folks after with the materials.
Great, thank you. And a question for you, Marita. This is from Anonymous. Some people I know are denied for their renewal of green cards. Do you know if this is something that is happening around the country? How do you suggest we should advise people?
Interesting question. I mean, I have heard from many immigration advocates that USCIS is just getting more, I guess the benevolent interpretation is stringent, but I will say draconian in their requirements. But I've not heard of people being denied renewal of their green cards. Rather than tell you how you can advise folks, I would recommend that you tell them to connect with an immigration attorney. Catholic Charities has immigration legal services offices across the country. And there is a network, the Immigration Advocates Network. Their website is immigrationadvocates.org, where they maintain a list of nonprofit and community-based immigration legal providers. So you can identify providers in your area and direct people who are running into problems to those organizations.
Thanks, Marita. And a question for Neil, can you let us know what Pew Research Center has planned for future studies on Asian Americans and disaggregated data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are going to be doing in the upcoming year more work on Asian Americans. We're still trying to figure out how to do a bigger survey that we would like to do. We're still raising funds for that because it's quite a big endeavor. But we're planning on doing more work disaggregating the data, really telling the holistic kind of story, but also the differences among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So that is something that we're planning on doing over the next couple of years.
Wonderful, thank you. It looks like we have no further questions at this time. So Neil, Terry, Marita, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your information and data and wisdom. And everyone, thanks for hopping on this webinar. Oh, looks like we have one more question from Joseph. Which organizations are working in the low-income Asian communities to get out the vote? Joseph, I can answer this question. I think the best thing is to look in your state and city to understand what organizations are currently based there that are working with your local communities. Also, API Vote, which is a national organization based in DC, has also been doing a lot of get out the vote work as well. And I can share their website in a follow-up email. Carrie, is there anything you want to add?
Nope, that's exactly who I was going to suggest.
Okay, wonderful. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to end the webinar.